Really excited to talk about reciprocal verbs in the passé composé. Believe it or not, I truly am excited because when I was studying French, I remember being really confused. Some of the time we would say things like elles se sont peignées, and we would have agreement and number and gender, but at other times we had things like elles se sont parlées, and there was no agreement of number and gender. And I remember my grammar books explaining things to me in prose. Don't ever use prose to explain grammar. Use something visual or give people tricks. Okay, so if you are one of my students, you know that we're using Bon Voyage. We're in chapter Bon Voyage 2, and we're in chapter 5 right now. But this is for anybody who wants to know more about pronominal verbs in the passé composé. Pronominal verbs is an umbrella term for two kinds of verbs, reflexive verbs and reciprocal verbs. And no, you don't have to remember the names and the difference between them. And these are examples of that kind of verb. Anything that has the se in front of it in the infinitive form is a pronominal verb because it has a pronoun, an extra pronoun in front of it. So let's do a quick review. So in this sentence, Lucie lance. Lucie is the subject, lance is the verb. Lucie throws. Lucie lance le ballon. Lucie is still the subject, lance is still the verb, and le ballon is the direct object. Lucie lance le ballon à Nicolette. So, le ballon is still the direct object, and Nicolette is the indirect object. How do we know it's the indirect object? Because it has a in front of it. So notice that that last sentence has both a direct object and an indirect object. Okay. Look at this. There is an a in front of Nicolette, and that a makes it an indirect object. But why is there an a? Because the verb here is lancer a. If you look at the very first sentence, Lucie lance, the verb is just plain old lance, throw or throws. But we have in the last sentence, lance à. It means throws to. So how do you know if a verb usually has an indirect object? If the verb is used with à after it, it takes an indirect object. Look at all these. Some verbs can be used with or without the direct object, So we have écrire à, to write to, and then we have écrire, to write. So the difference between those two, look, tu écris à ta grand-mère, you write to your grandmother. Tu écris un roman, you write a novel. Il l'envoie à Harvard University, he sends it to Harvard University. But j'envoie un colis, I send a package or a box, or a parcel, if you will. Parler à is to talk to. Elle parle au professeur. She speaks to the professor. But just plain old parler is to speak or to talk. Elle parle 3 langues. She speaks 3 languages. Donner, to give. Je donne un examen. But donner à is to give to. Je donne un examen aux élèves. So, here's just a couple of examples of pronominal verbs, and I have highlighted in green the extra pronoun. Quick examples. Push pause if you need to. So, back to Bon Voyage 2, chapter 5. So, let's look at reflexive pronouns right now in the present tense. So, the ones with the direct object. Jean voit souvent son ami. Son ami voit souvent Jean. So, Jean sees his friend often. Son ami, his friend sees Jean souvent. His friend sees Jean often. Jean et son ami se voient souvent. Jean and his friend see each other often. Now let's look at ones with an indirect object. Tu parles souvent à Marie. Marie te parle souvent. So you speak often to Marie. Marie speaks often to you. Well, you speak to each other often. Vous vous parlez souvent. All of this is fine and well. But things get fuzzy and weird and complicated in the passé composé, because remember, it's in the passé composé when we have to think about agreement and number and gender on the verbs, and specifically on the past participle. So in the passé composé, all pronominal verbs are conjugated with être. And because they're conjugated with être, we have to think about agreement in number and gender on the past participle. So, look at the first examples. Jean a vu son ami et son ami a vu Jean. Jean et son ami se sont vus. But with these indirect ones, we have Jean a parlé à son ami et son ami a parlé à Jean. Jean spoke to his friend and his friend spoke to Jean. Jean et son ami se sont parlé. Notice on that second one, we don't have agreement in number and gender. Why? The short answer is because it's an indirect object. But how are you going to know that? My advice is you always just look at the verb. So in that first example, Jean et son ami se sont vus. Look at the verb and go, what's the verb, what's the verb, what's the verb? Oh yes, vu is the past participle of the verb voir. Oh, voir doesn't take a. I know that that's a direct object. So if it's a direct object, I know I have agreement in number and gender. The second one, you look at the verb parler. And you go, oh, yes, parler is a past participle of the verb parler with the R. Oh, and here, yeah, it looks like talk to someone, so it's going to be parler à. And you go, that's an indirect object. And when it's an indirect object, we do not have agreement in number and gender. So how do you know if it's a direct or an indirect object? First of all, look at the verb and ask, does it take a? So don't just look at the verb. You probably want to write it down, okay? So you look at these and you write down the verb and you go, does it take a? Does it take a? And then if it does not take, if it's a direct object pronoun, you have agreement in number and gender. If it is an indirect object pronoun, you do not have agreement in number and gender. When is it an indirect object pronoun? When it takes a. So those are your answers. Okay? So let's try a few more. So the first thing you're going to do is look at the verbs. Write them off to the side and ask yourself, do they take a or not? I encourage you to write these sentences down. Just push pause and then come back in a second. I'll still be here. So I've written down the verbs. So now what do? We know that if the verb has a, it's an indirect object. If it's an indirect object, there's no agreement in number and gender.